Hey guys, tonight we begin with the harsh, unfiltered reality of life in Tudor Britain. A world of plague pits, chamber pots, and fashion choices that could kill you. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your eyes flicker open. Congratulations. You've survived the night. That's already more than many in Tudor Britain could say. But don't celebrate too loudly. Your lungs are still full of smoke from last night's fire, and your throat tastes like wet wool. You're lying on what passes for a mattress, a lumpy sack of straw that hasn't been changed since Henry VIII had knees. It smells like a blend of mildew, goat, and failure. There's a cat somewhere in the room, but it's unclear whether it belongs to you or if it's just a squatter with fleas. Either way, you share the space. As the sun rises, or something vaguely like light leaks through your oiled parchment window, your senses are assaulted by the unmistakable aroma of your roommate emptying the chamber pot. Right into the street, of course. And with a cheery, "Gardyloo," shouted from above, it arcs through the morning air like a foul comet and splashes onto the cobbles below. You sit up. Big mistake. Your back audibly pops, your knees crackle like kindling, and you're immediately reminded that there is no such thing as central heating. There's a fire, sure, but it's about as effective as a candle in a wind tunnel. And the chimney? A polite suggestion, not an actual structure. The smoke has moved in, unpacked, and taken over. If you're poor, and let's be honest, you are, you're sharing this room with multiple people, all of whom snore like livestock and sweat like they're paid to do it. There is no privacy, no silence, just the rhythmic cough of your cousin in the corner and the occasional sound of rats holding a summit beneath the floorboards. There's no mirror, but if there were, you'd see your hair flattened by grease, your teeth slightly more diagonal than yesterday, and your eyes filled with that special blend of exhaustion and pre-modern scurvy. Time to start the day. Just try not to step in anything squishy on your way to the door. Let's talk dental hygiene, or more specifically, the tragic absence of it. In Tudor Britain, brushing your teeth was not a daily ritual. It wasn't even a ritual. It was more like a rumour. The average person didn't have toothpaste, toothbrushes, or a basic understanding of bacteria. What they did have was stale bread, mead, and the dental resilience of a brick wall. If you were lucky, and I use that word loosely, you might clean your teeth using a rag dipped in salt or soot. Because nothing says fresh breath like mouth abrasions and fireplace residue. Some folks chewed on mint leaves, cloves, or twigs. That's right, twigs, nature's toothbrush. Also nature's splinter delivery system. You might imagine that the wealthy fared better. After all, they had access to imports, education, and, oh no, wait, they were just as clueless. In fact, the upper class might have had worse teeth due to their sugar-rich diets. Sugar was expensive, and nothing says, "I'm rich and powerful," like gnashing your rotten molars into a candied fig. And if your tooth really started hurting, if it throbbed with the kind of pain that would make a modern person sprint to an emergency dentist, well, then it was time for the village barber surgeon. Yes, the same man who cuts your hair, bleeds your veins, and occasionally lops off a limb. He'll yank out your tooth using pliers that were sterilised in last week's rainwater and shame. No anaesthesia, no warning, just a firm grip, a strong wrist, and the kind of scream that echoes through family trees. The worst part? You'll probably keep the tooth. People wore them as necklaces, good luck charms, or gifts to the local saint. And don't expect any dentures. If you lose your teeth, you're stuck with a diet of thin porridge and regret. As for breath mints, not a thing. Your breath smells like a fermented stew of onions, ale, and mild despair. And everyone else's does too. It's a shared suffering, like taxes or plague. It's breakfast time in Tudor Britain, which is a lot like breakfast time today. If you removed coffee, cereal, fruit, and joy. The good news? You get to eat something warm. The bad news? It's mostly beige, and it tastes like wet despair. Let's start with the beverage. Is it tea? No. Coffee? Don't be ridiculous. You're drinking ale. Yes, ale. At breakfast. Because the water is teeming with bacteria and possibly ghosts. Children drank ale. Pregnant women drank ale. Monks drank ale. And they brewed it themselves while muttering prayers and possibly judging you. Now, on to the solid portion of the meal. Bread. It's coarse, brown, and somewhere between edible and exfoliating. If you're a peasant, it's barley or rye, which Tudor doctors warned caused gas and melancholy, both of which you now have, along with a mild chewing injury. Butter? Rare. Eggs? Maybe, if the hens haven't gone on strike. Bacon? Only if you're lucky and own a pig, and even then, it's more fat than meat. More lard than lean. More, why is this crunchy, than, breakfast. If you're wealthy, congratulations, your beige breakfast just got an upgrade to off-white. You might enjoy a nice trencher of manchet bread, the Tudor equivalent of artisanal, a slab of cheese with the texture of roof tile, and a boiled egg so overcooked it's wondering what it did to deserve this. Jam? No. That's what sugar is for, and sugar is expensive. Instead, you get honey, assuming you don't mind a few bee legs in it. And fruit? Don't even ask. Fruit was seasonal, suspect, and usually baked into oblivion to avoid humoral imbalances, because everyone lived in constant fear of upsetting their inner moistures. And you'd better eat quickly. You've got a full day of labour ahead of you. Whether you're hauling buckets, weaving wool, or pretending you understand the Book of Common Prayer, your energy needs to come from something. And that something is bread. Always bread. No pancakes, no smoothies, no avocado toast. Just bread, ale, and the lingering sensation that your mouth is somehow drier after eating. In Tudor Britain, breakfast isn't the most important meal of the day. It's just the one that reminds you you're still alive, and possibly mildly intoxicated. Welcome to Tudor fashion, where the motto might as well be, if it's not stiff, itchy, or potentially flammable, you're not wearing it right. Let's begin with the basics. Getting dressed isn't something you do quickly. It's a process, a ritual really, one that requires layers, assistance, and the willingness to feel like a sausage for the next 12 hours. If you're a man, congratulations. You get to wear tight hose that leave little to the imagination and even less to circulation. Your doublet, essentially a heavily padded vest with buttons designed by a sadist, squeezes your torso into the shape of a decorative wine bottle. Add a ruff around your neck that functions like a wearable pie crust, and you're ready to go nowhere fast. Ladies, you're not off the hook. First, the chemise, then the kirtle, then the farthingale, a hoop skirt that turns your hips into a hazardous rotating table. Next comes the bodice, which is so tight it can realign your internal organs. Finally, the ruff. It's starched within an inch of its life and guarantees you can't look down without headbutting your own fashion choices. All of this was topped with a hat or headdress that made you look either like a gothic cupcake or someone preparing for a pigeon duel. The goal wasn't comfort, it was status. The more impractical your outfit, the more people assumed you were wealthy. After all, only the rich could afford to wear something that made sitting, breathing, and digesting nearly impossible. And don't think these clothes came clean. Washing was rare, spot cleaning was aggressive, and perfume was poured liberally to hide the scent of, well, Tudor life. If you smelled like lavender and desperation, you were doing it right. Buttons were for show. Laces were everywhere. Zippers? Not invented. Elastic? Hilarious. Getting dressed often required another human being and possibly a stiff drink. And shoes? Wooden soles? Leather that hadn't heard of cushioning? By midday, your feet feel like they've been excommunicated. In Tudor Britain, fashion wasn't about expressing yourself. It was about surviving the day without passing out, falling down, or accidentally lighting yourself on fire from your own sleeves. All in the name of looking socially acceptable. Let's go for a walk. Just a casual Tudor stroll through town. You step out the door, take a deep breath, and immediately regret every life choice that led to this moment. The street? It's not paved. It's not even level. It's mud in the winter, dust in the summer, and year-round a swirling cocktail of animal dung, human waste, rotting food, and the occasional dead thing that no one's had the courage to poke. Tudor sanitation was aspirational. Chamber pots were emptied not into a designated sewage system, but directly out the window. With luck, someone might yell, "Garde l'eau! Watch out for the water!" before flinging last night's personal horrors onto the street below. If not, congratulations. You've just received the Elizabethan version of a surprise water balloon. The street-level problem was so bad, shoes had to evolve. Enter the pattern, a wooden platform you strapped to your actual shoes, so you wouldn't sink into the street like a sad biscuit in tea. Walking became a mix between tightrope acrobatics and parkour over various unspeakables. Now let's factor in the livestock. Pigs roamed freely. Geese strutted with authority. Horses had one job, to dump their business exactly where you were about to step. And since nobody cleaned up after them, unless by accident, the road became a glorious stew of hoofprints and horror, and heaven help you if it rained. Because then the street became a slow-moving slurry of filth, flowing toward the nearest ditch like a liquid monument to poor planning. One misstep, and you'd find yourself ankle-deep in Tudor regrets. You couldn't just tiptoe around the mess either. Most cities were packed, noisy, and extremely enthusiastic about pushing carts directly into your shin bones. And if you tripped and fell, that's your dignity gone, possibly your wallet, and absolutely your appetite. Oh, and the smell. Imagine a hot compost heap having a nervous breakdown. People carried pomanders, little balls filled with herbs, just to survive the scent of their own neighbourhoods. In short, if you're used to clean streets, garbage pickup, or the miracle of plumbing, Tudor Britain would treat your senses like a chew toy. So you've landed in Tudor Britain, and you're wondering, how do I move up in the world? The answer is, you don't. You stay put, like a decorative tapestry nailed to a damp castle wall. Tudor society was neatly stacked like a wedding cake made of stone and passive aggression. At the top, you've got the monarch, a person who could literally order your beheading because your hat offended them. Below that, nobles. Below them, gentry. Below them, merchants. Then finally, you, a commoner. Possibly a peasant. Possibly a serf. Possibly something even less glamorous, like person who cleans out the chamber pots but still gets taxed. Being born into a low class wasn't just inconvenient, it was a life sentence. You couldn't just marry your way up unless you were obscenely lucky or unusually hot by 16th century standards, which meant pale, plump, and potentially tuberculosis chic. Education for the rich, land for the richer, rights? Well, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Everything from your clothes to your dinner plate to the length of your sleeves screamed your status. Literally. Sumptuary laws made sure of it. These were actual laws dictating what colours and fabrics you could wear based on your rank. Want to wear purple? Sorry, that's reserved for royalty and people who own more than one fork, and heaven forbid you get ideas. Ambition was considered dangerous. If you spoke too eloquently, someone might accuse you of witchcraft or treason, both of which came with the charming side effect of being publicly executed in front of a jeering crowd and a meat pie vendor. Your job was to know your place, speak when spoken to, work until you die. And if you somehow caught the attention of someone powerful, congratulations, you now get to be exploited more formally. Even religion didn't help. The church reinforced the idea that God wanted you to be poor, that your suffering was noble, that your lack of food and excessive number of children was a divine blessing. How comforting. If you're dreaming of a cozy Tudor job with reasonable hours, health benefits, and maybe a dental plan, allow us to introduce you to reality, now with more blisters and tetanus. Work in Tudor Britain wasn't something you did to fulfill your potential or build a career. It was something you did so you wouldn't die even faster. From dawn to dusk, and sometimes well beyond that, your body was the primary tool, and if it broke, you got replaced, probably by your child. Let's say you're a farmer. Great. That means you wake up before sunrise, eat a crust of something that wishes it were bread, and then spend the next 12 hours covered in mud, sweat, and possibly livestock byproducts. Your plough is made of wood, your hands are calloused into oblivion, and your one good ox is probably limping. You can't call in sick because sick is your default setting. But maybe you're a skilled tradesman. Fancy. That means instead of freezing in a field, you get to freeze in a workshop, inhaling sawdust or lead fumes while working by candlelight. If you're a blacksmith, congratulations. Your profession is basically medieval CrossFit, minus the Instagram clout. If you're a cooper, you make barrels until your spine resembles a decorative question mark. And don't forget the servants. If you're working in a noble house, you're on call 24/7, sleeping in the hallway, and waking up to the gentle sound of someone yelling at you for not lighting the fire fast enough. Your reward? Leftovers. Cold ones. If you're lucky. Children were expected to work as soon as they were old enough to stop swallowing tools. Chimney sweeps, stable boys, water carriers. You name it. There was a 10-year-old doing it badly, cheaply, and dangerously. Women didn't escape this joyride either. In addition to raising enough children to field a Tudor soccer team with substitutes, they also spun wool, churned butter, carried water, cooked over open flames, and somehow still got blamed if the bread burned or the cow gave side-eye. Vacations didn't exist. Weekends weren't invented. Rest was what you did when your body gave out and nobody noticed for a few hours. Feeling a bit under the weather in Tudor Britain? Perhaps a sore throat, a little fever, or a suspicious boil that seems to be whispering Latin? Great. It's time to call the doctor. Just know, whatever's about to happen next, it's not science. It's more like medieval improv, but with knives and leeches. First off, there were doctors, if you were rich. And even then, their methods had less to do with healing and more to do with humours. Not the funny kind, but the ancient theory that your body was governed by 4 mystical fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If you were sick, it clearly meant your bile to phlegm ratio was acting out of line. Obviously. And the solution? Bloodletting. Lots of it. You'd be pricked, sliced, or bled with cheerful abandon until you were weak enough to forget you were still sick. Some barbers doubled as surgeons. Yes, the man shaving your chin might also amputate your leg. Often with the same tools. Sanitized? Only in the sense that he probably wiped them on his apron first. If you were poor, which statistically you were, your healthcare came from the local wise woman, your cousin who knows herbs, or a man selling potions out of a suspiciously dented cart. Common treatments included garlic stuffed into wounds, applying warm dung to the chest for asthma, or drinking mercury because someone said it chased away bad spirits. Dentistry? That was just praying your teeth fell out on their own before someone with pliers and 0 qualifications got involved. Anesthetics didn't exist. The closest you got to pain relief was alcohol, which also doubled as the disinfectant, the surgeon's courage, and your ride into unconsciousness. And let's not forget the plague. When it arrived, which it did often, doctors wore bird masks stuffed with herbs to ward off miasma, the evil air that caused disease. This was considered cutting edge. Meanwhile, actual cutting edges were being used on your buboes. No gloves, no clue. In Tudor Britain, you didn't choose religion. Religion chose you, usually with the force of a royal decree and the subtlety of a brick through a stained glass window. This was not a time of peaceful theological reflection. It was a time when kings and queens played spiritual musical chairs, and everyone else had to pray whichever way the throne was facing that week, or risk losing their head. Literally. Henry VIII kicked things off by breaking up with the Pope in the world's most aggressive divorce. Suddenly, England wasn't Catholic anymore. Now you were expected to swear allegiance to the Church of England, which conveniently made Henry the boss of both your taxes and your soul. Refuse to switch sides? Enjoy your complimentary heresy trial and a one-way trip to the stake. Then Mary I came along, Henry's daughter, and she was very Catholic. As in, let's burn 280 Protestants alive to make a point. Catholic. If your family owned an English Bible, it was time to bury it in the garden and hope your neighbours weren't feeling snitchy. You could be executed simply for praying the wrong way, reading the wrong version of scripture, or looking too smug during Mass. Next up, Elizabeth I. She swung things back to Protestantism, but with a wink. As long as you weren't too Catholic or too Protestant, and you didn't stir the pot, you could probably survive. Probably. Unless you were a Jesuit, or Irish, or in the wrong place at the wrong time. Religion in Tudor England was a bit like walking a tightrope over a shark tank, wearing bells. Church attendance was mandatory. As in, fined if you don't go mandatory. Priests doubled as local informants. Sermons were often thinly veiled political speeches, and nobody was quite sure if God approved of you unless the Queen said so. Confess the wrong belief, and you'd end up in the tower. Stay silent, and someone might accuse you anyway just to gain your land. So no, you didn't find faith in Tudor Britain. You clung to whatever belief system wouldn't get you boiled alive that month and muttered your prayers through gritted teeth while checking over your shoulder. Just when you thought your life in Tudor Britain couldn't get worse. Surprise. It's plague season. Again. It's like pumpkin spice lattes in the modern world, but with more screaming and far less cinnamon. The plague didn't just show up once and ruin everybody's month. It came back regularly, like an unwanted dinner guest who never got the hint. Every few years, the Black Death, or one of its charming cousins, would waltz into town and start turning bodies into statistics, faster than you could say, mysterious swelling. Symptoms? Glad you asked. First, a fever, then headaches, then lovely oozing buboes, painful swellings in places you'd rather not discuss. People turned black and blue as their organs decided it was a good day to fail. Death usually arrived in a matter of days, unless you were unlucky and lingered. Hygiene, of course, wasn't exactly winning any awards. People dumped chamber pots into the streets, rats had the run of the place, and fleas were the most active healthcare workers in the kingdom, albeit with questionable methods. Your odds of survival improved only if you fled the city fast enough, or if you had a naturally antisocial personality that kept you from catching literally everything. The government's response? Quarantine. Which, in Tudor terms, meant nailing your front door shut and painting a red cross on it while your neighbours prayed loudly that you wouldn't sneeze near their livestock. If you died inside, well, eventually someone would come by to collect the bodies. Probably. Doctors, if you were rich enough to afford one, wore terrifying beaked masks stuffed with herbs, which they believed filtered out the bad air. It didn't, but it did make them look like evil bird lawyers, so that's something. Plague also had a knack for messing with the economy. Markets shut down, trade stalled, and labour shortages meant your local blacksmith might also be your new midwife. Entire families vanished, towns emptied overnight, and rumours of divine punishment soared, usually blaming women, foreigners, or, you guessed it, cats. If you survived, congratulations. You were either naturally immune or just lucky. Either way, don't get too comfortable. Another wave will be along shortly, and this time it might bring friends. So you've survived plague, poor hygiene, and a surprise heresy accusation. Congratulations. Time to treat yourself to a bit of entertainment. Just don't expect a Netflix binge or a relaxing walk in the park. Tudor leisure time was equal parts public humiliation, animal cruelty, and bafflingly enthusiastic death. Let's start with the obvious crowd pleaser. Public executions. These weren't just punishments, they were events. People brought snacks, parents brought children. You'd stand shoulder to shoulder with neighbours, gossiping about who was getting hanged, drawn, and quartered that week. The best seats were right by the scaffold, assuming you didn't mind getting a bit of blood on your bread. Hangings were for common criminals. Noble types, naturally, got beheadings. If you were lucky, it was a clean slice. If not, well, the executioner would get a few swings in before things wrapped up, and the crowd would cheer, or boo, depending on how entertaining the suffering was. Still too tame? Welcome to bear baiting, a sport where a bear, yes, a literal bear, was chained to a post while dogs were sent in to attack it. The bear often won, until it didn't. Occasionally, the dogs were also mutilated ahead of time, just to spice things up. The audience loved it. If you were feeling fancy, you could catch a play at the local theatre. Shakespeare was active during the later Tudor years, and his tragedies had just enough murder and cross-dressing to please even the grumpiest ale-soaked spectator. But don't imagine a polite audience. This was less silent contemplation and more drunken shouting. If a scene bored you, you could throw a turnip at the stage. It was interactive theatre with produce. For more wholesome fun, there were cockfights where people bet money on chickens violently pecking each other to death. Or you could gather in the town square for a good old-fashioned pillorying, watching your neighbour get pelted with rotten food for stealing bread. Classic. Dancing and music did exist, but only if you weren't too poor or dead. And games like dice and cards were enjoyed by many, until the church condemned them as sinful distractions from proper suffering. Let's say, against all odds, you've survived the morning chamber pot ambush, dodged the plague, and even avoided getting crushed by a runaway cart full of turnips. You lock eyes with someone across the muddy square. Sparks fly. Your heart races. Your palms sweat, though that could be the lice. Is this love? No. No, it's not. This is Tudor Britain. Romance is less soulmate and more strategic land acquisition. Marriage in Tudor times was a transaction first, second, and third. Love, if it ever showed up, arrived late, confused, and slightly drunk. Families arranged matches like livestock trades. Dowries were exchanged, inheritances were secured, and the emotional well-being of the bride was considered somewhere below. How many goats does her father have? For the nobility, marriages were political chess moves. Your feelings on the matter? Irrelevant. You could be a teenage girl marrying a man who remembers the Crusades. If he had a title and you had a womb, it was a perfect match. For peasants, it was slightly more flexible. You might marry someone because your cows grazed the same field. Romantic. Courtship, as such, was largely a supervised series of negotiations disguised as affection. A man might write you a love poem, sure, but only after confirming your father owned at least 2 pigs and a decent patch of barley. And that poem, probably plagiarized from the local friar's collection of flirtatious psalms. Sex before marriage was technically a sin, which meant most people did it anyway, then lied about it. Or, if you got caught, you'd be hauled before the church court, where you'd either admit to being pre-contracted, an unofficial engagement, or mumble something about having been bewitched by her eyes. Either way, a fine was usually involved. For women, marriage was more or less the start of full-time domestic servitude, childbirth roulette, and possibly being blamed for your husband's gout. For men, it was the end of bachelor freedom and the beginning of financial stress, and also childbirth roulette. Adultery, rampant, discretion, minimal, divorce, technically possible, but only if you were a monarch with a habit of executing your exes. Otherwise, you were in it for life, or until the next plague took care of the paperwork. If you enjoy hot showers, minty toothpaste, or the basic sensation of not being sticky at all times, Tudor Britain is not your vibe. Let's begin with bathing. The Tudors had bathtubs, yes, but they were largely decorative, or used to store firewood. The average person bathed seasonally, which is a polite way of saying almost never. Soap existed, but it was made of lye and pig fat, meaning using it was slightly better than scrubbing with a brick. But didn't Queen Elizabeth bathe once a month? Sure, allegedly. But she was the Queen. You, peasant viewer of this hypothetical historical video, would be lucky to rinse your feet in a muddy stream between ploughing fields and dying of trench mouth. Water itself was suspect. Clean drinking water wasn't common in towns and cities, so most people drank ale, even for breakfast. Children drank weak beer. Babies? Possibly beer-flavoured porridge. Meanwhile, washing with water was thought to open your pores to disease. So many opted for the no wash or no plague method. Shockingly, it didn't work. To manage the stench, people layered on perfumes and herbs. Imagine BO, wet dog, and lavender trying to negotiate peace in your nostrils. It wasn't pleasant, but it was period accurate. Hair care? Scalp hygiene was more of a suggestion than a practice. Lice combs were a common accessory, and delousing was a romantic couple's activity. Wigs were powdered with everything from starch to crushed bone, so even the fashionably clean weren't. Teeth? A Tudor smile was rustic. They cleaned teeth with cloth, soot, salt, or crushed oyster shells, all of which sound more like flooring materials than hygiene tools. Elizabeth I's teeth reportedly turned black from sugar. Since she was considered a trendsetter, others started blackening their own teeth intentionally. That's right, the Queen's rotting smile was a fashion statement. Clothing wasn't washed often either. Instead, people changed their linen underclothes when they turned see-through with grime. Outer garments might be brushed or beaten, but washing them? Too risky. The fabric might disintegrate, or worse, shrink. And a shrunk doublet was a social disaster. So, let's say you committed a crime in Tudor Britain. Perhaps you stole a loaf of bread, or insulted someone's hat, or heaven forbid had thoughts. Congratulations. You've earned a crash course in a justice system that's about 10% law and 90% spectacle. First things first. Forget lawyers, rights, or the concept of a fair trial. Trials were quick, often over before you could say, wait, that's not mine. Your defense might be a mumble, a prayer, or just hoping the judge was drunk and merciful. Spoiler, he wasn't. Now, the punishment. This was the Tudor version of public service announcement meets medieval Yelp review. Petty crimes, stocks. You'd be locked in place while townsfolk threw things at you. Vegetables if they were kind, rocks if they weren't, or, in a particularly Tudor twist, dead rats. Because why not? For more serious crimes, you might get whipped in the town square, or branded with a hot iron, or have your ears cut off, a kind of Tudor loyalty card. Collect both, and the pain is free. Adultery, public shaming, slander, cut out your tongue, repeat offences, hangings, quick, if lucky, botched, if usual. And then there were the executions for capital crimes, treason, witchcraft, saying something weird during Lent. Hanging was the default, but if you really annoyed the monarchy, it escalated fast. Hanging, drawing, and quartering. That's where they kill you 4 times for the price of 1, and scatter your body parts around as medieval Pinterest decor. Beheadings? Reserved for nobles? But even that had risks. If the executioner had shaky hands or a rough night, you might get the deluxe package. 1 swing, 2 swings. Oh dear. Anne Boleyn at least got a French swordsman. That was considered classy. If you were lucky, and we're stretching lucky here, you might be pardoned and sent to the colonies. But that's like escaping a fire by jumping into a well. A very cold, foreign, raccoon-infested well. Justice in Tudor Britain wasn't about rehabilitation or reform. It was about fear, theatre, and proving that whatever you did, the consequences would be memorably awful. So if you're ever time-travelling, and feel the urge to pocket an extra chicken leg or mumble about the Queen's wig, don't. Just don't. Sleep. That magical time when your body recharges, your brain consolidates memories, and you get to briefly forget that you're living in Tudor Britain. Except, you don't. Because in Tudor Britain, sleep is a hazardous activity. First off, forget plush mattresses. You'll be lucky to sleep on a straw-stuffed sack that smells faintly of mildew, goat, and generational disappointment. If you're rich, you might get a wooden bed with ropes strung across the frame to hold up the mattress. Hence the phrase, sleep tight, which originally meant tighten the ropes before your back gives out. As for privacy, unlikely. Families often slept together, parents, children, the neighbour's dog, possibly the neighbour. Even servants might crash at the foot of the bed. The concept of personal space hadn't been invented yet, and beds weren't just crowded, they were strategic. People often slept in shifts in case of burglars, fires, or something called night air, which was believed to cause disease. That's right, people thought the dark itself could kill you. So windows were sealed, air was still, and the room became a humid stew of farts and paranoia. Sleep itself was also divided. Many Tudors practiced first sleep and second sleep, with a 2-hour break in the middle of the night to meditate, pray, chop wood, or argue quietly with your spouse. There's nothing quite like waking up at 1 a.m. and deciding it's time to churn butter. Let's not forget fire risk. Most homes were wooden, roofs were thatched, and candles were basically flaming sticks of doom. Falling asleep with one lit was the 16th century version of playing Russian roulette. Good night, and maybe good luck. And then there were the bugs. Lice, fleas, bed bugs, all part of the Tudor mattress experience. If you weren't scratching, you were probably already dead. Did we mention supernatural paranoia? Ghosts, witches, and demons were taken very seriously. Sleepwalking might get you accused of possession. A bad dream? Proof you were cursed. The cure? Bleeding, prayers, or a sharp slap from a priest. The Silk Road was not a single road, but a sprawling network of trade arteries that stitched together continents. From the bustling markets of China to the grand bazaars of Constantinople, caravans carried silk, spices, precious stones, and knowledge across thousands of miles. But travelling this vast expanse was not for the faint of heart. Endless deserts baked men and animals alike, mountain passes threatened with avalanches, and open plains exposed merchants to the ever-present danger of bandit raids. To survive such journeys, traders needed more than courage. They needed safe havens along the way. This is where caravanserais entered the story. In medieval Turkey, especially under the Seljuk sultans of the 11th to 13th centuries, these roadside fortresses transformed the Silk Road into a reliable commercial lifeline. Constructed roughly every 20 to 30 miles, the distance a caravan could travel in a single day, caravanserais became essential oases of safety. Their placement wasn't accidental. Each one was strategically positioned at crossroads, mountain passes, or near rivers where the journey was most treacherous. For weary travellers, reaching a caravanserai at dusk must have felt like salvation. From afar, they would see massive stone walls rising out of the barren landscape, a sign that warmth, food, and protection awaited. Guards at the gates welcomed traders, pilgrims, and wandering dervishes alike, for caravanserais were open to anyone regardless of origin or faith. Inside, a great courtyard offered space for camels, horses, and mules, while chambers around the edges provided rest for their human companions. But these inns were more than just shelters. They were lifelines of trust. A merchant, carrying delicate silks from China or glassware from Venice, could rest assured that his cargo would be safe behind thick walls patrolled by guards. Fires burned in the communal halls, hot meals were served, and water flowed from fountains designed to refresh both people and animals. In a time when one ambush could erase a lifetime of profit, caravanserais gave traders the confidence to keep moving forward. Without them, the Silk Road might have been nothing more than a dangerous gamble. With them, it became a thriving artery of commerce and cultural exchange, proving that stone, mortar, and hospitality could hold the world together. At first glance, a caravanserai in medieval Turkey looked less like an inn and more like a fortress. These structures were deliberately imposing, designed to intimidate bandits and reassure travellers that they had entered a sanctuary. Built of massive blocks of stone, often limestone or basalt depending on the region, the caravanserai was engineered to endure centuries of harsh weather and human conflict. The most striking feature was the exterior wall. Rising high above the surrounding landscape, these walls formed a nearly impenetrable barrier. The only entrance was a monumental gateway, often arched and intricately decorated with Seljuk geometric patterns and calligraphy. Yet behind its beauty lay practicality. The heavy wooden doors could be barred shut, turning the Caravanserais into a fortress at night. Bandits or raiders might roam the plains, but once inside, a merchant could finally breathe easy. Crossing the threshold, travellers entered a vast rectangular courtyard. This open space was the heart of the complex, designed to accommodate entire caravans of camels, horses, and mules. Around the courtyard stretched rows of vaulted chambers, their thick stone walls providing insulation from blistering summer heat and bitter winter cold. Each room had a simple purpose: to give traders, pilgrims, and animals a safe, dry place to rest before the next day's journey. At the centre of many caravanserais stood a small mosque or prayer niche, reminding guests that faith was as important to survival as food and shelter. Nearby, fountains and wells provided clean water, essential for both humans and beasts. In some of the grander caravanserais, such as those commissioned by the Seljuk Sultan Alaeddin Keykubat, architects added stables, storerooms, bathhouses, and even kitchens to prepare hot meals. But the architecture was not only functional, it was symbolic. The monumental gateways and detailed stonework sent a clear message. The Sultan's authority reached even into the remotest corners of the empire. Caravanserais stood as visible signs of order in a world of uncertainty. Every wall, every arch, every courtyard spoke of a promise. Under Seljuk rule, trade and travel were protected. For a weary traveller, this architecture wasn't just stone and mortar. It was reassurance. It meant that no matter how perilous the road, there would always be a stronghold waiting on the horizon. Stepping into a caravanserai was like entering a small, temporary village. Though its stone walls looked austere from the outside, the life that pulsed within was vibrant, diverse, and full of human stories. For weary travellers who had trudged across dusty plains or windswept mountain passes, the atmosphere inside was one of relief, safety, and anticipation. Merchants were the lifeblood of these places. Silk traders from China, spice dealers from India, fur merchants from Central Asia, and glassmakers from Venice might all find themselves sharing the same courtyard on a given night. Their camels were led into stables along the walls, where attendants helped unload heavy bales of goods. In exchange for a modest fee, or sometimes entirely free under state patronage, merchants could eat, rest, and plan the next leg of their journey without fear of theft or ambush. Meals were a communal affair. Caravanserai kitchens often prepared hearty stews, flatbreads and lentil soups, food that could satisfy men who had marched alongside their animals all day. The smell of roasting meat mingled with the smoke of fires, drifting through the vaulted chambers. Around these fires, merchants exchanged not only food, but also stories, tales of distant markets, whispered rumours of bandits on the road ahead, or news from faraway courts. In this way, caravanserais became hubs of information, as well as trade. Religion was ever present. Many caravanserais included a small masjid, either a domed chamber or a raised platform in the courtyard, where travellers performed evening and morning prayers. Pilgrims en route to Mecca often mingled with merchants and wandering dervishes, giving the space a spiritual as well as commercial significance. But life inside was not all solemnity. There was a buzz of commerce and human interaction. Local villagers sometimes gathered outside the caravanserai walls to sell fresh produce, firewood, or crafted goods to travellers. Within, healers treated sick animals, scribes drafted contracts, and sometimes entertainers, musicians, poets, or storytellers, lightened the mood after a long day on the road. Despite its transient nature, the caravanserai fostered a unique sense of community. For a single night, strangers from every corner of the known world became neighbours, bound together by the shared experience of the Silk Road. When dawn came and the gates opened, the caravan dispersed again into the wilderness, carrying with it not only goods, but also ideas, friendships, and memories born within those protective walls. Hospitality was not a luxury in medieval Turkey, It was a sacred duty. Rooted in both Islamic tradition and Turkic customs, the Caravanserai embodied this principle in stone. Every traveller, regardless of wealth, faith, or nationality, was entitled to shelter and protection within its walls. This spirit of generosity transformed the Silk Road from a perilous gamble into a lifeline of trust. Upon arrival, guests were greeted not as burdens, but as honoured wayfarers. Some caravanserais, especially those funded by the Seljuk sultans, offered food and lodging free of charge for 3 nights. Hot bread, steaming stews, and fresh water were provided to restore strength, while attendants helped tend to animals with hay and grain. For many merchants, this hospitality was more than kindness. It was survival. A hungry man could not travel, and a weak caravan could not keep commerce flowing. Yet hospitality alone was not enough. The roads were plagued by bandits, tribal raiders, and opportunistic thieves who targeted caravans heavy with silks, spices, and gold. Caravanserais therefore doubled as fortresses. Their thick walls, guarded gates, and watchtowers deterred attackers. Once the massive wooden doors were shut at dusk, no intruder could easily breach them. Guards patrolled the courtyards and stables, ensuring the safety of both men and goods through the night. Inside, rules were enforced to maintain peace among travellers. A merchant carrying Venetian glass might be sharing space with a fur trader from the Russian steppes or a spice dealer from India. With so much wealth gathered under one roof, disputes could easily flare. Caravanserai overseers, often appointed by the state, acted as mediators, ensuring order and fairness. This sense of security encouraged merchants to press forward with their journeys rather than abandon them to fear. The combination of hospitality and security made caravanserais not only safe havens, but also instruments of state power. They projected the image of a strong and benevolent ruler, one who could guarantee both justice and protection. Each traveller who rested under their vaulted roofs left with renewed loyalty to the Sultan's authority. For the exhausted pilgrim, the weary merchant, or the solitary wanderer, the caravanserai was more than stone walls. It was a promise. A promise that, no matter how long or treacherous the road, there would always be a place where kindness was offered, goods were safeguarded, and the night could be passed in peace. Inside the stone walls of a medieval Turkish caravanserai, the world came together. These roadside fortresses were more than inns. They were crossroads of civilizations, where merchants, pilgrims, and wanderers from vastly different lands found themselves eating, praying, and resting side by side. On any given night, the courtyard might echo with the sounds of 6 languages, from Persian and Arabic to Greek, Armenian, and even Chinese. Merchants carried more than goods, they carried ideas. A silk dealer from Samarkand might share tales of Mongol conquests, while a Venetian trader spoke of politics in distant Europe. Pilgrims journeying to Mecca brought with them religious devotion, while dervishes spread mystical teachings that blurred the lines between trade and spirituality. For many travellers, the caravanserai was their first direct encounter with cultures and beliefs far beyond their homeland. These exchanges weren't limited to words. Objects themselves became ambassadors of culture. A ceramic bowl from Anatolia might be traded for Indian spices. A manuscript in Arabic script might be purchased by a scholar from Byzantium. Artisans learned new techniques, cooks discovered exotic flavours, and physicians exchanged medical knowledge that blended Greco-Roman traditions with Persian and Islamic science. In this way, caravanserais acted as conduits of intellectual and artistic fusion. Religious diversity, too, was on full display. While Islam shaped the architecture and daily rhythm of prayer, non-Muslim travellers were not turned away. Christians, Jews, Buddhists, and others found shelter under the same roof. In a world often divided by faith, caravanserais became rare sanctuaries of coexistence, where necessity forged tolerance. Music and storytelling added to this cultural tapestry. Evenings were often filled with songs played on lutes or flutes and stories of distant heroes or tragic romances. For the weary merchant, such moments offered not only entertainment, but also a reminder of home. For locals who sometimes gathered at caravanserais to trade with passing caravans, it was a window into a world much larger than their village. In this melting pot of languages, goods, and traditions, caravanserais became more than way stations. They were engines of cultural exchange, ensuring that the Silk Road carried not only the weight of silk and spices, but also the richness of human connection. Behind those stone walls, medieval Turkey became a meeting ground for the world. Caravanserais were not just resting places. They were engines that fueled the economy of medieval Turkey and the broader Silk Road. Without them, the flow of commerce would have sputtered under the constant threats of fatigue, theft, and uncertainty. With them, trade became reliable, profitable, and expansive, feeding both local markets and global connections. Every caravan that entered a caravanserai carried wealth in motion. Bales of silk from China, spices from India, furs from Central Asia, and glassware from Venice all converged in Anatolia, the bridge between East and West. The Seljuk rulers recognized this strategic advantage. By building and maintaining caravanserais, they created a commercial infrastructure that encouraged merchants to pass through their lands, rather than risk alternative routes. Each stop meant more goods sold, more taxes collected, and more prosperity for the empire. Economically, caravanserais served as stabilizers. They allowed merchants to travel longer distances without fear of ruin, which in turn expanded the scale of trade. Local farmers and artisans benefited as well. Villagers near caravanserais sold grain, vegetables, firewood, and textiles to travelers, injecting wealth into rural communities. Craftsmen found steady markets for their wares, while moneylenders and scribes offered services to merchants who needed contracts or loans. In this way, caravanserais spread economic activity outward, enriching both cities and villages. Some caravanserais also functioned as miniature marketplaces. Merchants who wished to lighten their loads or test new markets often traded directly with other travelers inside the courtyard. Deals struck under those vaulted roofs could ripple across continents. A merchant from Damascus might sell textiles to a Genoese trader, who would then carry them to Europe, where they fetched triple the price. The caravanserai became a node in a global network of profit. Equally important was the element of trust. Because caravanserais offered guarded storage rooms, merchants could leave valuable cargo overnight without fear of theft. This security encouraged investment in larger and more expensive goods, raising the stakes and the rewards of commerce. The Seljuk state's sponsorship further reinforced confidence. When a sultan guaranteed safe passage, merchants listened. In essence, the caravanserai was a machine of wealth. Each stone laid by the builders was an investment in trade. Each meal served to a traveller a deposit in the empire's prosperity. By protecting merchants and smoothing the flow of goods, caravanserais turned Anatolia into one of the most dynamic economic crossroads of the medieval world. Caravanserais may have been built for merchants, but their influence extended far beyond commerce. They were also sanctuaries for pilgrims, symbols of political authority, and tools of imperial power in medieval Turkey. Within their stone walls, faith and governance intertwined as seamlessly as trade and travel. For pilgrims, caravanserais were lifelines on the long road to holy sites. Muslim pilgrims journeying toward Mecca relied on them for shelter, food, and protection. Christian pilgrims en route to Jerusalem or Armenian monasteries in Anatolia also found refuge there. In offering safety to those on sacred missions, rulers not only upheld religious duty, but also won the loyalty of believers. Hospitality became a form of piety, and caravanserais became visible reminders that the state safeguarded both body and soul. But religion was only part of the story. Caravanserais also served as instruments of politics. Every grand gate adorned with Seljuk geometric carvings, every inscription praising the Sultan, reminded travellers of whose authority they were under. By investing in these monumental structures, rulers projected both strength and benevolence. They were fortresses against chaos, yet they were also symbols of generosity. To pass through Anatolia, and see caravanserai after caravanserai was to be constantly reassured that the Sultan's reach extended across the empire's roads. Pilgrims and traders alike carried stories of this hospitality far and wide. A merchant who enjoyed safety in Seljuk lands might compare it favourably to the dangers elsewhere, spreading the empire's reputation across continents. This reputation was not just good for business, it was good for politics. It strengthened alliances, attracted foreign merchants, and made Anatolia the preferred corridor between East and West. Caravanserais also played subtle roles in diplomacy and intelligence. Travellers brought news of wars, shifting alliances, and rival markets. Overseers of caravanserais, appointed by the state, often reported such information back to the authorities. In this way, a steady stream of intelligence flowed through the empire, carried on the tongues of weary pilgrims and calculating merchants alike. In short, caravanserais were not neutral spaces. They were stages where faith, power, and politics all played their parts. They gave shelter to pilgrims, confidence to merchants, and legitimacy to rulers. Every bowl of soup served, and every gate guarded carried a deeper message, that the empire was both protector and provider, uniting commerce, devotion, and governance along the arteries of the Silk Road. For centuries, caravanserais stood as the beating heart of Anatolia's trade and travel. But no institution remains untouched by the march of history. By the late medieval period, the caravanserai system that had once flourished under the Seljuks began to face decline. The reasons were many: political, economic, and technological, and together they transformed these once bustling fortresses into relics of a bygone era. The first blow came with the fragmentation of political power. The Seljuk Empire, which had poured resources into building and maintaining caravanserais, weakened and eventually fractured into smaller principalities. Without centralized authority, the upkeep of these massive stone structures became inconsistent. Some fell into disrepair as local rulers shifted priorities toward fortifications or palaces, leaving travelers with fewer reliable havens. At the same time, the rise of the Ottoman Empire reshaped trade routes. While the Ottomans continued to build caravanserais, they increasingly emphasized urban centers, ports, and larger cities as hubs of commerce. Maritime trade also expanded rapidly during the late medieval and early modern periods. The Mediterranean and Red Sea routes grew in importance as European powers developed stronger navies and overseas empires. Sea lanes became faster, safer, and more profitable than the arduous overland trek across Anatolia. As a result, caravans diminished in size and frequency, leaving caravanserais quieter and emptier. The Mongol invasions and subsequent instability across Central Asia also disrupted the Silk Road itself. With parts of the route plagued by war or insecurity, fewer long-distance merchants ventured westward. Those who did often preferred to deal through intermediaries, rather than endure the perils of crossing multiple unstable regions. Caravanserais, once crowded with camels and merchants, saw fewer guests. Yet decline did not mean disappearance. Many caravanserais found new life as local trading posts, military garrisons, or even village centres. Some became way stations for smaller-scale regional trade, supporting local economies rather than global commerce. Others, abandoned and crumbling, stood as silent witnesses to the road's vanished glory. Their massive gates and weathered courtyards told stories of a time when Anatolia had been the hinge between worlds. By the dawn of the modern era, caravanserais had lost their central role in international trade, but they never lost their symbolic weight. They became reminders of a golden age when the roads of Turkey thrummed with the footsteps of pilgrims, merchants, and adventurers. Decline had dimmed their light, but it had not erased their legacy. Though their golden age has long passed, caravanserais remain some of the most enduring monuments of medieval Turkey. Their stone walls, still standing in many parts of Anatolia, whisper stories of merchants, pilgrims, and empires that once pulsed through their gates. Today, they are more than ruins. They are symbols of cultural memory, architectural brilliance, and the timeless human need for connection. Many caravanserais, such as the Grand Sultanhane near Aksaray, still display the ingenuity of Seljuk builders. Their monumental gates, intricate stone carvings, and vast courtyards showcase a marriage of functionality and artistry. For historians and architects, these structures are invaluable records of medieval engineering, combining defensive strength with aesthetic detail. Their survival through centuries of war, weather, and neglect is a testament to the skill and vision of their creators. But the legacy of caravanserais is not just architectural, it is cultural. They remind us that globalization did not begin in the modern age. Long before airplanes or shipping containers, these roadside inns facilitated exchanges that shaped the medieval world. Spices that flavoured European kitchens, silks that adorned Ottoman courts, and stories that crossed continents all passed through their gates. Every merchant who rested inside contributed to a vast web of cultural fusion that still influences cuisine, art, and ideas today. In Turkey, many caravanserais have been restored and repurposed as museums, cultural centres, or even hotels. Visitors can walk through their echoing courtyards and imagine the bustle of camels and traders, the flicker of lanterns at night, and the hum of voices in a dozen languages. This revival keeps the memory of the Silk Road alive, transforming ancient walls into living classrooms for modern generations. Perhaps the greatest legacy of the caravanserai is the idea of shared humanity. These fortresses of hospitality stood as sanctuaries for anyone, regardless of faith or origin. In an age often marked by division, they offered a rare vision of coexistence. To step inside was to be protected not only by stone walls, but by a code of generosity and mutual respect. Today, when we speak of global trade, cultural exchange, or the meeting of East and West, the spirit of the caravanserai lingers. It is a reminder that roads do more than move goods. They connect people. And in those connections, civilizations are born, thrive, and leave their mark on history. When people imagine the Silk Road, they often picture camels burdened with bales of silk, merchants weighing spices, and caravans trudging across deserts. Yet the Silk Road carried more than tangible goods. It carried invisible treasures, music, melodies, and instruments that transcended borders. The sound of the Silk Road was as vital as its silk and spices, weaving together cultures in ways that words alone never could. Music travelled easily because it required no translation. A melody plucked on a lute in Persia could enchant a traveller from China who had never heard such tones before. A drumbeat that rallied horsemen on the Central Asian steppes could stir the heart of a trader from the Mediterranean. As caravans met, rested and mingled at caravanserais, music became the universal language. Performers entertained weary travellers, merchants shared songs from home, and new styles began to blend into hybrid traditions. Instruments themselves were like ambassadors. The Chinese pipa, a pear-shaped lute, found its way westward, influencing the design of Persian and Arab instruments. The Persian oud, in turn, journeyed east, leaving echoes in Chinese and Central Asian stringed instruments. Indian tablas and Persian tambours inspired rhythmic experimentation across the road. Each instrument carried centuries of cultural memory, and when exchanged, they gave birth to entirely new sounds. The Silk Road also transformed how instruments were used. In Persia, the lute accompanied court poetry. In Central Asia, drums were vital for nomadic rituals and horseback ceremonies. In China, zithers and flutes were central to Confucian refinement. As instruments moved, they adapted to new settings, sometimes joining royal orchestras, sometimes filling village festivals with song. This exchange didn't erase local traditions. Instead, it enriched them, layering one musical vocabulary upon another. Perhaps most importantly, music softened the harsh realities of travel. Nights in caravanserais or under the desert sky often ended with performances. Traders would sit by fires, sharing not only food and stories, but also melodies. A Venetian merchant might hear a Persian ballad for the first time, while a Chinese traveller might join in a Central Asian dance rhythm. In these moments, music turned strangers into companions and competitors into allies, reminding all who travelled that they were part of something larger than themselves. The Silk Road's soundscape was more than entertainment. It was the heartbeat of cultural exchange. Without it, the journey would have been far quieter, and the legacy of the Silk Road far poorer. Among the many instruments that travelled the Silk Road, none had an impact as profound as the Persian lute, known as the barbat in its early form and later the oud. Its deep, resonant voice carried not only music, but also the prestige of the Persian courts, making it a symbol of refinement and empire. The barbat originated in ancient Persia, where it was prized for its expressive tone. Its rounded body, short neck, and gut strings allowed musicians to pluck out melodies both mournful and joyous. By the early Islamic era, the instrument had become the darling of scholars, poets, and rulers. In Baghdad's Golden Age, philosophers like Al-Farabi wrote treatises on its tuning and tonal range, describing it as an instrument capable of capturing the human soul. For Persians, the lute was not just a tool for entertainment. It was an embodiment of intellect, artistry, and civilization itself. As caravans moved westward, the lute followed. Along the Silk Road it reached the Arab world, where it transformed into the oud, a slightly larger, more refined version of the barbat. From there, it spread across North Africa and into Spain, giving rise to the European lute that would dominate Renaissance music centuries later. Without the Persian barbat, Europe's musical landscape might have sounded very different. But the lute also travelled east. Traders and musicians carried it into Central Asia and eventually China, where its influence can be traced in the development of the pipa, the Chinese pear-shaped lute. While the pipa took on its own unique identity, its lineage reflects centuries of borrowing, reshaping, and cultural adaptation. The Silk Road turned the lute into a true citizen of the world. Its significance was not only musical, but also political. For rulers, showcasing the lute in court was a way of displaying sophistication. A sultan who sponsored lute players was aligning himself with the prestige of Persia's intellectual tradition. Performances during banquets, poetry recitals, or diplomatic gatherings reinforced the image of music as a bridge between power and culture. In many ways, the Persian lute became the soundtrack of empire. Its voice resonated from palaces to caravanserais, carrying with it the authority of Persia and the promise of connection. Long after empires fell, the lute's descendants continued to shape music across continents, living proof that a single instrument could echo through civilizations. If the Persian lute was the voice of the West, the Chinese pipa was the echoing answer of the East. With its pear-shaped body, 4 strings, and elegant frets, the pipa became one of the most iconic instruments of China's musical tradition. Yet its history, like so much along the Silk Road, was shaped by movement, exchange, and transformation. The origins of the pipa can be traced back to Central Asia, where plucked lutes with long necks were common among nomadic tribes. Around the 4th century CE, these instruments travelled eastward into China, carried by traders, migrants, and musicians. There, they merged with local traditions and evolved into the form that would later be celebrated in Chinese courts and operas. The name pipa itself reflects its technique: pai for pushing the strings outward and pa for pulling them inward. By the Tang dynasty, 7th-10th centuries, the pipa was at its height of glory. Court musicians in Chang'an, the cosmopolitan capital, played it for emperors, foreign dignitaries, and scholars. Its sound was described as both delicate and fierce, capable of mimicking the flutter of bird wings or the clash of armies. Painters and poets immortalized it, while female musicians were often depicted cradling the instrument as a symbol of elegance and allure. The pipa was no longer a foreign import. It had become a distinctly Chinese cultural treasure, yet the pipa never lost its global ties. As caravans moved west, the instrument journeyed with them, influencing the musical cultures of Persia and beyond. Some scholars argue that the evolution of the Persian lute and the Chinese pipa were parallel dialogues across the Silk Road, each shaping and reflecting the other. In Japan, the pipa gave rise to the biwa, an instrument closely tied to Buddhist storytelling. In Korea, it inspired the bipa. Everywhere it travelled, the instrument adapted, but its core identity, a lute of expressive power, remained intact. The pipa's versatility was key to its success. It could accompany poetry recitations, dramatic operas, or solo performances that dazzled audiences with rapid plucking techniques. In caravanserais and villages, it might have sounded alongside foreign instruments, blending Eastern scales with Western rhythms. Through it, the voice of China joined the global conversation of Silk Road music, proving that strings, like words, could travel and evolve. The pipa's journey reminds us that music is never still. Like the caravans that carried it, the instrument was always moving, always adapting, its melodies a soundtrack to centuries of cultural exchange. While Persia and China contributed elegant lutes and refined court instruments, the vast Central Asian steppes brought rhythm, power and pulse to the Silk Road. For nomadic peoples, Turks, Mongols and other steppe tribes, music was inseparable from daily life, warfare and ritual. Their instruments were not made for quiet chambers, but for open skies and galloping horses. At the heart of this tradition were drums. The darbuka and dohol, cylindrical or goblet-shaped drums, thundered across campfires and ceremonies. But it was the great kettle drum, the nakara, that carried true symbolic weight. Mounted on horseback or strapped to camels, these booming instruments signalled the movements of armies and the presence of rulers. A column of horsemen arriving with drums pounding was both music and message. Power was on the march. Equally vital was the role of rhythm in community rituals. Shamans used frame drums in spiritual ceremonies, believing their beats could bridge the human and the divine. In weddings, harvest festivals, and warrior initiations, drums gave structure to dance and anchored communal expression. Without written language or permanent monuments, rhythm itself became the memory of the steppe, an oral tradition carried on skins stretched over wood. But Central Asian music was not only percussive. The nomads developed a unique form of horseback performance, where musicians played small portable instruments even while riding. The most famous was the morin khur, or horsehead fiddle, with its haunting, resonant sound that seemed to mimic the neighing of horses or the wind sweeping across grasslands. This instrument, often played by bards, accompanied epic songs recounting battles, migrations, and ancestral legends. Its soundscape embodied the nomadic soul. As caravans crossed these regions, travellers could not escape the rhythms of the steppe. Merchants resting in yurts would hear the beat of drums alongside the crackle of fires, or the fiddle's drone echoing against the silence of the plains. Some of these instruments travelled with them, finding places in Persian, Chinese, and Ottoman ensembles. Others remained rooted in nomadic identity, influencing global music indirectly through their techniques and scales. Central Asia's rhythms gave the Silk Road its heartbeat. They reminded traders and pilgrims alike that the road was not only a corridor of goods, but also of stories told in sound. Stories of warriors, spirits, and the eternal partnership between man, horse, and drum. India's contribution to the Silk Road soundscape was as rich and intricate as the spices and textiles it exported. From the Ganges plain to the courts of the Deccan, music was deeply tied to spiritual devotion, storytelling, and scholarly pursuit. The subcontinent's instruments carried complexity, subtlety, and a philosophical depth that left a lasting mark on Eurasian music. One of the most influential gifts was the family of plucked string instruments that eventually gave rise to the sitar. Long before the sitar itself emerged in the Mughal courts of the 16th century, its ancestors, the veena and the rudra veena, were shaping India's musical tradition. These instruments, with their long necks, resonating gourds, and fretted fingerboards, produced melodies that could bend, glide, and sustain notes in ways that astonished foreign ears. The veena's ability to mirror the subtle inflections of the human voice made it perfect for accompanying devotional hymns and recitations of epic poetry. Equally important was rhythm. India's system of tala, intricate rhythmic cycles, was unlike anything merchants or musicians from Persia, China, or Central Asia had encountered. The mridangam and the early forms of tabla created patterns that wove in and out of melody with mathematical precision, turning percussion into a language of its own. For a Silk Road traveller hearing Indian ensembles, it was as if time itself was being stretched and shaped into art. As caravans reached Indian markets, musicians and travellers carried these sounds outward. The veena and its relatives influenced the evolution of the Persian sitar, literally three-string, which later inspired the Mughal sitar. Drums, too, left their mark. Indian rhythms filtered into Persian and Central Asian traditions, blending with simpler step beats to form hybrid patterns. Beyond the instruments themselves, India's concept of raga, a framework for melodic improvisation tied to mood, time of day and season, fascinated foreign musicians. It presented music not just as entertainment, but as a path to spiritual elevation. This idea resonated deeply with Sufis in Persia and Central Asia, who embraced music as a tool for transcendence. Through strings and rhythms, India offered the Silk Road both technical mastery and philosophical depth. Its instruments carried not just sound, but entire systems of thought, systems that would echo in the courts of Persia, the caravans of Central Asia, and centuries later in the concert halls of the West. While the Silk Road is often remembered for exotic instruments with strings and frets, one of the most enduring contributions from the Middle East was far simpler: the human voice, guided and supported by the frame drum. This combination, voice and rhythm, proved so powerful that it resonated across cultures, becoming a staple of music from the Mediterranean to Central Asia. The frame drum, known in different regions as the daf, rik or bender, was deceptively modest in design. A wooden frame stretched with animal skin, sometimes adorned with metal rings or jingles, it could be played with subtle taps or thunderous rolls. Despite its simplicity, the instrument carried enormous cultural weight. In Sufi rituals, the daf was believed to echo the heartbeat of the universe, guiding dervishes into spiritual ecstasy. In everyday settings, it anchored dances, weddings, and communal gatherings, ensuring that rhythm was never far from life's most important moments. The Middle East also gifted the Silk Road a tradition of vocal music unlike any other. Arabic and Persian singing styles emphasized ornamentation, microtones, and emotional intensity. A single phrase could stretch into a cascade of notes, each one bending and gliding to express longing, joy, or devotion. To foreign ears, especially those from China or Europe, accustomed to more rigid tonal systems, this music seemed otherworldly. When combined, the frame drum and the voice became a force that transcended language. A Persian singer accompanied by a daf could move a Chinese traveller to tears without the need for translation. Caravans stopping at Middle Eastern caravanserais often reported evenings filled with such performances, nights where merchants, pilgrims and locals gathered to listen as rhythms and voices intertwined. These were not just entertainments, they were experiences of shared humanity. The influence spread outward in both directions. Central Asian shamans incorporated the frame drum into their rituals, adapting it to their own spiritual practices. Further east, Chinese and Indian musicians experimented with incorporating its rhythms into their ensembles. Meanwhile, the vocal ornamentation of Persian and Arab traditions seeped into Byzantine chant, Ottoman court music, and even, much later, the folk styles of southern Europe. The legacy of the Middle Eastern frame drum and voice is one of simplicity masking depth. With nothing more than skin, wood, and breath, it provided the Silk Road with its most universal instruments, the beat of life and the cry of the soul. Among the wide grasslands of Mongolia and Central Asia, music was not confined to courts or temples. It lived in the open air, carried on the wind, intertwined with the rhythm of hooves. The nomadic tribes of the steppe contributed one of the most haunting instruments of the Silk Road, the morin khur, or horsehead fiddle. With its carved horse's head crowning the neck and its strings resonating like the call of the plains, it became a symbol of identity as much as an instrument of sound. The morin khur was unlike the polished lutes of Persia or the ornate pipers of China. Its sound was raw, almost primal, yet deeply expressive. Played with a bow strung with horsehair, the instrument could mimic the neigh of a stallion, the rush of the wind, or the mournful cry of a herder far from home. For nomads, whose lives revolved around horses, it was more than music. It was kinship, a way of conversing with the very animal that sustained their livelihood. Epic storytelling accompanied the horsehead fiddle. Steppe bards, known as uligershi or storytellers, recited long oral epics of battles, migrations, and heroes. The fiddle provided the musical backbone, droning and weaving through the verses, guiding audiences through tales that could last hours, or even days. In this way, the Morin khor was not only an instrument of entertainment, but a vessel of history, carrying ancestral memory from one generation to the next. For Silk Road travellers passing through the steppes, the sound of the horsehead fiddle was unforgettable. Merchants from China or Persia, resting in yurts after long journeys, would be enveloped in songs that spoke of open skies and endless horizons. Many brought back descriptions, or even instruments themselves, to their homelands, sparking curiosity and influence far beyond the steppe. The Morin khor also carried spiritual significance. Shamans employed it in rituals, believing its sounds could summon spirits or bridge the worlds of humans and gods. The carved horse's head was not merely decorative, but symbolic, honouring the sacred role of the horse in nomadic cosmology. Through the Silk Road, the horsehead fiddle's voice joined the global orchestra. It added depth and texture to the great soundscape of Eurasia, a reminder that music could be born not from empires or cities, but from the boundless freedom of the steppe. The Silk Road was not a one-way street of musical exchange. It was a living laboratory where traditions met, mingled, and fused into new forms. Just as merchants blended spices and artisans fused artistic styles, musicians absorbed, adapted, and transformed the sounds they encountered along their journeys. The result was a constantly shifting soundscape that reflected the diversity of Eurasia itself. In the bustling caravanserais of Persia, or the market squares of Samarkand, it was common to hear instruments from far-flung lands played together. A Chinese pipa might accompany a Persian oud, while Central Asian drums laid down rhythms beneath Indian stringed instruments. Musicians who shared meals and stories also shared melodies, learning one another's scales, rhythms, and playing techniques. These exchanges were rarely formal. They happened organically through nights of performance and improvisation. Religious traditions encouraged fusion as well. Sufi mystics embraced instruments and rhythms from India, Central Asia, and the Middle East, weaving them into ceremonies of devotion. Buddhist monks carried flutes and chants from India into China, where they influenced temple music and court rituals. Even Christian liturgical music in the Byzantine Empire absorbed Middle Eastern ornamentation and rhythmic patterns, proof of how porous the borders of sound could be. New instruments themselves often emerged from this cultural alchemy. The Persian sitar, a direct ancestor of the Mughal sitar, likely developed under the influence of Indian venas and Central Asian lutes. The Japanese biwa descended from the Chinese pipa, which itself had absorbed elements of Persian and Central Asian design. Each instrument bore the fingerprints of multiple civilizations, shaped by centuries of migration and adaptation. Fusion was not only technical, but emotional. When musicians blended traditions, they created performances that spoke to audiences of many backgrounds. A merchant from Damascus might recognize a familiar rhythm in a song performed in Kashgar, while a traveller from Xi'an might be moved by a scale that echoed melodies from his homeland. Music thus became a unifying force, reminding diverse peoples of their shared humanity. The Silk Road's genius was in its openness. It did not preserve traditions in isolation. It encouraged them to intertwine. The sound that emerged was neither wholly Persian nor Chinese, neither Indian nor Central Asian. It was all of these at once. Fusion was the Silk Road's greatest composition, a melody of civilizations played in harmony. Although the caravans of the Silk Road have long vanished, their melodies still linger in the instruments and traditions that survive today. The music exchanged along this vast network did not fade with the empires that built it. Instead, it seeped into the foundations of Eurasian culture, leaving a legacy that continues to echo across continents. Take the Persian oud. Its journey westward gave birth to the European lute, which in turn shaped Renaissance and Baroque music. Entire genres of Western classical tradition, from troubadour ballads to courtly dances, owe their existence to an instrument that first found voice in Persia. Similarly, the Chinese pipa inspired the Japanese biwa and the Korean bipa, each of which became integral to their own courtly and religious repertoires. The sitar, born of Indian and Persian influences, eventually crossed oceans and transformed global music in the modern era, from classical ragas to 20th century rock. Rhythmic traditions also carried forward. The frame drums of the Middle East still accompany Sufi ceremonies, but their influence can also be traced in Mediterranean folk music, and even flamenco in Spain. Central Asia's horsehead fiddle remains a cultural treasure in Mongolia, yet its unique bowing style has inspired experimentation in world music ensembles across the globe. Everywhere we look, the Silk Road's fingerprints remain etched in the universal language of music. Perhaps more important than individual instruments was the idea the Silk Road embodied, that music thrives on exchange. By carrying melodies across deserts and mountains, the Silk Road demonstrated that art grows richer when it encounters the unfamiliar. The improvisational structures of Indian ragas, the ornamentation of Arabic singing, the pentatonic modes of Chinese flutes, all found ways to converse and coexist. This spirit of fusion continues today as world musicians collaborate across cultures, echoing the same creative curiosity that once thrived in caravanserais. In the end, the Silk Road's musical legacy is not confined to museums or scholarly studies. It lives in every note played on a lute, every drum beat at a festival, every song that blends traditions across borders. The road may no longer exist as it once did, but its music remains immortal. It reminds us that long before globalization had a name, melodies were already crossing borders, weaving cultures together into harmony. When we think of Vikings, the first images that come to mind are longships cutting across stormy seas, axes flashing in raids, and warriors shouting battle cries. Yet the Viking world was not solely defined by war and conquest. In their homelands, across Norway, Denmark, and Iceland, life demanded more than fighting. It demanded community, leisure, and the forging of honor through contests that mirrored the values of the battlefield without the bloodshed. This is where games and sports became an essential part of Viking culture. The long winters of Scandinavia left plenty of time indoors, when storms kept ships beached and swords sheathed. During these months, games of strategy and wit filled the halls. Outdoors, in warmer seasons, physical contests tested strength, agility, and endurance. These activities were not pastimes in the modern sense of the word. For Vikings, games were training grounds, shaping the skills needed for survival and reinforcing the ideals of bravery, cunning, and perseverance. Honor was at the heart of every Viking contest. To win a game, whether by clever strategy at a board or brute strength in a wrestling match, was to prove oneself before peers. Losing could sting, but refusing to compete was far worse, for it suggested weakness. In sagas and poetry, descriptions of games often serve as moments where characters reveal their true nature. A hero who outwits his foe in a board game is just as celebrated as the warrior who triumphs with a blade. Games also forged bonds within Viking communities. Feasts, weddings, and seasonal gatherings often included competitions. Young men tested themselves against elders, while families and clans measured their strength and skill against rivals. Even when tempers flared, and they often did, these games were essential in maintaining the social fabric. They provided safe outlets for rivalries and opportunities for leaders to demonstrate fairness by settling disputes over results. But Viking sports weren't only for warriors. Women, too, played roles in games of chance and strategy, and children learned early through playful contests that echoed the skills they would need in adulthood. The games spanned all ages and classes, reminding everyone that strength of body and mind was valued across society. Beyond the battlefield, the Viking world thrummed with contests of wit, endurance, and honor. These games were not distractions, but living reflections of the values that defined the Norse people: courage, cunning, resilience, and above all, the pursuit of glory, even in play. Among the many games played in the Viking Age, Hnefatafl, often called the King's Table, stood out as the most popular and prestigious. Unlike the rough and tumble physical contests of the Norse world, this was a battle of minds. Vikings cherished cunning as much as brute strength, and Hnefatafl offered a perfect arena to prove one's wit. The game board looked similar to a primitive form of chess or checkers, but the mechanics were unique. One side controlled a king and his defenders, placed in the center of the board, while the other side commanded a larger force of attackers surrounding the edges. The goal for the king was to escape to one of the board's corners, while the attackers aimed to trap and capture him. It was a simulation of siege warfare in miniature, a reflection of the strategic challenges Vikings faced both on the battlefield and at sea. Unlike dice games of chance, Hnefatafl required careful planning, foresight, and adaptability. Each move could shift the balance between victory and disaster. To win, a player had to anticipate the opponent's tactics, feint, and sometimes sacrifice pieces for the greater goal. These were the same skills valued in Viking raids, where leaders had to think several steps ahead, weighing risks against rewards. It's no wonder sagas describe great warriors sharpening their strategic minds with this game. Beyond its entertainment value, Hnefatafl was deeply social. Families played it around hearthfires, and warriors carried portable boards during voyages, carving grids into wood or even stone. Archaeologists have uncovered gaming boards and pieces in Viking burials, a sign of the game's importance even in the afterlife. To be buried with a Hnefatafl set was to declare that one's cunning and leadership were as essential as weapons and armor. The game also had symbolic weight. In Norse society, a king was expected to be both a warrior and a strategist. By defending his piece on the board, a player enacted the role of protector, mirroring the responsibility of real rulers. Losing one's king was more than defeat. It was a metaphor for dishonor and downfall. Though chess would eventually replace Hnefatafl in later centuries, its legacy endures. It reveals that Vikings were not mere raiders, but thinkers who valued intellect alongside muscle. In the halls of Scandinavia, victory could come not only through swinging an axe, but by outmaneuvering an opponent across the king's table. If Hnefatafl tested the Viking mind, wrestling tested the Viking body. Known in Old Norse as glima, wrestling was one of the most respected and widespread sports in Scandinavia. It was more than simple grappling. It was a disciplined trial of strength, balance, and honor, deeply rooted in the Viking way of life. Unlike the staged wrestling of modern entertainment, Viking glima was a serious contest with clear rules. Opponents began the match by grasping each other's belts or tunics, using strength, leverage, and footwork to force the other to the ground. Victory didn't come from sheer brute force, but from a mixture of skill, cunning, and control. Matches could last a long time, with competitors circling, feinting, and attempting to trip or throw each other in ways that displayed both athleticism and patience. The sport was not confined to backyards or farmsteads. Wrestling matches often took place at feasts, assemblies, and seasonal gatherings. During festivals like the Thing, a combination of political assembly and social celebration, spectators gathered to cheer on their champions. Winning such contests could elevate a young man's reputation, marking him as a worthy warrior or even a potential leader. Defeat, while less glorious, still demonstrated bravery for stepping into the ring. Wrestling was also practical training. The Vikings valued it as preparation for battle, where grappling skills might mean the difference between life and death in close combat. A warrior who could wrestle effectively had a better chance of surviving when his weapon was lost, or when combat turned into a desperate struggle on the ground. This connection between sport and survival elevated glima beyond mere recreation. It was part of the warrior's toolkit. The sagas preserve many accounts of wrestling contests, often used as dramatic moments to reveal a hero's character. A champion who threw opponents with ease proved his dominance, while one who wrestled fairly, without cruelty or arrogance, gained admiration for his honor. Sometimes matches turned violent, especially when pride or grudges were involved. But the ideal of Glima emphasized restraint and fairness, reinforcing social order even in moments of fierce competition. What's remarkable is that Glima survived long after the Viking Age. It continued as a traditional Icelandic sport, practiced for centuries and even recognized in modern times as Iceland's national wrestling style. In this endurance, we see the lasting legacy of a Viking pastime that tested strength, sharpened skill, and reflected the values of honor and respect. For the Vikings, mastery over water was not optional, it was survival. Their entire culture revolved around the sea, from launching daring raids across Europe to fishing in icy fjords. It's no surprise, then, that swimming held a special place among Viking sports. To swim in their world was not a leisurely pastime, but a demonstration of endurance, courage, and the ability to defy nature itself. The sagas tell us that swimming contests were a common way for young men to prove themselves. Competitions often took place in rivers or coastal waters, where participants tested who could swim the farthest, the fastest, or endure the longest in cold conditions. Endurance mattered just as much as speed. Some stories even describe brutal variations, where opponents attempted to drag one another under the water, turning a test of skill into a contest of survival. Emerging victorious from such a challenge was proof of both strength and unshakable will. Swimming also tied directly into Viking warfare. A warrior who could swim had an undeniable advantage if a ship capsized, or a raid ended in pursuit across rivers. In sagas like that of Grettir the Strong, swimming feats are celebrated as heroic accomplishments equal to slaying foes in battle. The ability to stay afloat in icy waters wasn't just sport. It was a practical skill that could mean the difference between life and death. The settings of these contests were often unforgiving. Imagine plunging into a glacial river fed by melting snow, the shock of the cold cutting into your chest, while rivals swam beside you, each striving to outlast the others. Enduring such trials demonstrated resilience that impressed both peers and elders. For Vikings, conquering the cold was a way of showing dominance over nature itself. Swimming contests were also part of community gatherings. During festivals or feasts, young men would compete in rivers while crowds lined the banks, cheering them on. Victories won admiration, and in some cases, could raise a man's social standing. A skilled swimmer gained not just bragging rights, but also the trust of his comrades on future sea voyages. Through swimming, the Vikings turned necessity into honor. The water that gave them life, through fish, travel, and trade, also tested their bodies and spirits. To excel in the river or sea was to prove that one was not only fit for the ship's oar, but also worthy of the Viking name itself. Long before Scandinavia became a land of famous winter Olympians, the Vikings were already masters of ice and snow. In their harsh northern homelands, where winter gripped the land for much of the year, skiing and skating were not just entertainment, but essential skills. Yet, like all Viking pastimes, they were transformed into contests of skill, speed, and honor. Skiing, in particular, had deep roots in Norse culture. Archaeological finds show that skis were used in Scandinavia as far back as 6,000 years ago, and by the Viking Age, they had become both a practical tool and a sport. Vikings used wooden skis to hunt in snowbound forests, to travel between settlements, and to chase prey across frozen terrain. But once survival was secured, skiing became competitive. Races tested who could glide the fastest across snowy fields, or navigate treacherous hills with the greatest agility. These contests mirrored the Viking admiration for balance, strength, and mastery over the environment. The Norse even had a god associated with skiing, Ulla, a deity of winter, archery, and hunting, often depicted with skis and a bow. Invoking Ulla's name before a race added a divine dimension to the sport, framing skiing not just as recreation, but as a sacred skill. Victorious racers could claim they had the favour of Ulla himself. Skating was another beloved winter activity. Vikings strapped bones, often from animals like cattle or horses, to their boots and used poles to push themselves across frozen lakes and rivers. Though clumsy by modern standards, These bone skates allowed surprising speed and agility on the ice. Children and adults alike joined in, turning frozen waters into makeshift arenas for games, races, and feats of balance. The skill of skating proved useful in real life as well, helping scouts or hunters travel quickly in winter conditions. Winter sports were also social events. During long, dark winters, when farm work slowed and raiding season paused, communities gathered for skiing races or skating competitions. These contests broke the monotony of the season and gave young men opportunities to prove their prowess before peers, elders, and potential brides. In these snowy games, the Viking spirit of competition thrived. Skiing and skating combined necessity with sport, turning survival skills into displays of courage and agility. To glide across the ice or snow faster than anyone else was to show mastery over both nature and one's own body. A true Viking achievement. For the Vikings, weapons were more than tools of war. They were extensions of identity. A good sword or bow was as much a symbol of honour as it was a means of survival. Unsurprisingly, many Viking games revolved around practicing with weapons, turning deadly skills into contests of accuracy, speed, and daring. These weapon games were not simply diversions. They were training exercises disguised as sport. Archery was among the most common. Using self-bows carved from yew or ash, Vikings tested who could hit targets from the farthest distance or with the greatest precision. Targets ranged from wooden boards to improvised objects like barrels, logs, or even floating pieces of wood on rivers. Archery contests sharpened skills essential for hunting and battle alike. A Viking who could strike a target at distance was not only admired at feasts, but also trusted in the shield wall, where arrows could decide the outcome of a clash. Throwing games were equally popular. Spears and axes, both iconic Viking weapons, became instruments of competition. Warriors tested who could hurl an axe the farthest, or stick it cleanly into a wooden post. The saga literature even records dangerous variations, where men threw spears back and forth, catching them mid-air to prove their agility and bravery. Such games blurred the line between sport and combat, transforming training into spectacle. Swordplay, too, had its playful forms. Young men engaged in mock duels with blunted blades or wooden practice swords, sparring to demonstrate reflexes and courage. These bouts often ended in laughter, though tempers could flare and turn the game into something far more serious. Still, mock combat was an important way to prepare young warriors for the realities of battle. What made these contests uniquely Viking was the combination of practicality and honour. To excel in weapon games was to prove not only one's skill, but also one's readiness for real combat. Victories in archery or axe throwing could raise a man's reputation, while poor performance might invite ridicule. Women and children sometimes participated as well, especially in archery, showing that weapon skills were valued across the community. These games were woven into feasts, festivals, and gatherings, ensuring that warriors never lost touch with their martial skills even in peacetime. Precision with a bow, strength in the arm, and courage in the heart. These were the qualities sharpened through Viking weapon games. To play was to prepare, and to prepare was to live up to the Viking ideal of honour. No Viking gathering was complete without a feast, and no feast was complete without contests to prove endurance, wit, and humour. While battles of sword and shield measured strength on the battlefield, the drinking hall became its own kind of arena. Here, men tested their capacity for ale and mead, their cleverness in wordplay, and their ability to hold composure as cups were drained and songs filled the smoky air. Drinking was not simply about indulgence. It was ritual, social glue, and an opportunity to earn or lose honour. Mead horns were passed from hand to hand, each man expected to drink deeply. Games emerged around these customs. One popular challenge was endurance drinking. Who could empty the largest horn or drain it the fastest without faltering? Another variation tested stamina. How many rounds could a man endure before slurring his words or collapsing under the table? Feasting contests were not limited to alcohol. Eating competitions, especially involving meat or bread, sometimes accompanied the revelry. A warrior's appetite was seen as proof of his vitality, and to devour more than one's peers was to display a kind of strength. Of course, failing to keep up could invite laughter and mockery, a blow to one's pride as damaging as losing a wrestling match. Verbal games also thrived in the mead hall. Flighting, a kind of verbal duel or insult contest, was a sharp-witted exchange where participants hurled boasts and barbs at one another, often with the entire hall as witness. Success required quick thinking and clever phrasing. A warrior who held his own in flighting proved that his tongue was as sharp as his blade. Failure, on the other hand, risked humiliation. These drinking and feasting games carried risks. Too much ale could cloud judgment, and sagas record feasts where contests escalated into violence. Yet within controlled bounds, they reinforced Viking ideals. A man who drank bravely, ate heartily, and spoke boldly was admired. Feasting contests also strengthened community bonds, ensuring that laughter, music, and storytelling balanced the harshness of raiding and farming life. In the glow of torchlight, with horns raised high and tables heavy with food, the Vikings transformed simple acts of eating and drinking into trials of honour. The hall became as much a battlefield as the open sea. Only here, victory was won not with steel, but with stomach, wit, and the ability to endure the night. In a society so closely tied to farming, herding, and seafaring, animals played a central role in Viking life. It's no surprise, then, that animals also found their way into Viking games and contests. Among the most striking and controversial to modern eyes were horse fights, brutal spectacles where strength, aggression, and honour were tested not only in men, but in their prized beasts. The horse was a sacred animal to the Vikings, tied to fertility, warfare, and even the gods. Owning a strong, well-bred horse was a mark of prestige, and contests between stallions became a way to demonstrate wealth and dominance. During festivals or gatherings, horses were brought together to fight, spurred into aggression while crowds looked on. The battles could be fierce, with neighs and hooves filling the air, as handlers encouraged their animals to clash. The horse that prevailed brought pride not just to itself but to its owner, whose honour rose with the victory. These fights were not only entertainment, but social theatre. They offered men the chance to display their breeding stock, assert their power, and sometimes even settle rivalries. A victorious horse added to the status of its owner, while a defeated animal could damage a man's reputation. Saga literature occasionally records disputes escalating after horse fights, as pride and anger spilled over into human feuds. Horses weren't the only animals drawn into contests. Dogs, too, were trained for fights or competitions of hunting skill. Strong hounds that could bring down game or win in challenges were highly prized. Falcons and hawks, symbols of nobility, were sometimes judged for their prowess in catching prey. These animal contests highlighted the Viking belief that strength and dominance extended beyond humans. It was a trait admired in all creatures. To us today, the idea of forcing animals into combat may seem cruel, but for the Vikings, it was part of a worldview that valued toughness, resilience, and the spectacle of power. Just as men proved themselves in wrestling or archery, so too did their animals serve as extensions of their honour. Through these contests, Vikings reinforced a culture where prestige was measured in every arena. On the battlefield, in the feast hall, and even in the strength of the beasts they bred and trained. To witness a horse fight was to see Viking values reflected in muscle, fury, and the relentless pursuit of dominance. For the Vikings, games were never just diversions, they were reflections of their deepest values: honour, courage, cunning, and resilience. Whether seated at a board playing hnefatafl, grappling in a wrestling match, or plunging into icy waters, each contest was part of a greater legacy, one that stretched beyond victory and defeat into the very fabric of Norse identity. In saga literature, games often serve as pivotal moments in a character's story. A hero might reveal his brilliance not on the battlefield, but by outmanoeuvring rivals at the king's table. A quarrel sparked during a wrestling match could escalate into a blood feud that shaped an entire narrative. In this way, Viking games were never trivial. They were stages where reputation was built, tested, and sometimes destroyed. The emphasis on honour tied games to community memory. Winning was not just a personal triumph, but a public claim to respect. The applause of peers, the recognition of elders, and the whispers of admiration all helped cement a man's standing in society. For the Vikings, to be remembered as a strong wrestler, a cunning player, or a fearless swimmer was to carve one's name into the collective saga of the people. Games also bridged generations. Fathers taught their sons the rules of Glima or the strategies of Hnefatafl, passing down not only skills but ideals of fair play, courage, and persistence. Women participated too, through board games, storytelling competitions, and even verbal flighting, ensuring that honour was not limited to the battlefield, but woven into the everyday fabric of Viking households. In this sense, games helped sustain cultural values, ensuring they survived long after battles were forgotten. What makes Viking games so striking is how seamlessly they blurred the line between play and life. Wrestling prepared warriors for combat, archery sharpened hunters for survival, swimming trained sailors for shipwrecks. Even drinking games reflected the endurance and resilience expected of a Viking. Every contest, no matter how playful, carried echoes of real struggle and survival. Today, their legacy endures in subtle ways. Icelandic Glima wrestling still thrives as a national sport. Strategic board games echo the logic of Hnefatafl. Winter skiing and archery remain Nordic traditions. The Vikings remind us that games, when infused with meaning, become more than entertainment. They become tools for shaping identity and vehicles for carrying honour into eternity.